I have the distinct honor, and in my case, I think a pleasure, of introducing Cathy Crowe, someone who if anybody walked in the shoes or the shadow or in the path of June Callwood, I think Cathy Crowe not only walks but runs in those footsteps. I, for many years, was a journalist, and for a long time walked as well in shadows of someone else, my father, who introduced me to Cathy Crowe as part of the movement to try to reestablish housing programs, not just in Toronto, not just in Ontario, not just in the country, but housing as a reality right across every community in this land. And when I met Cathy, I have to say, as a journalist, my ability to even pretend, which was always a bit of a struggle for me to be objective, was completely thrown out the window. I was inspired, I was humbled, I was challenged, but more importantly, I was led to do better journalism. And when you do better journalism, you become a better citizen. Quite often, journalists surrender their citizenship when they become journalists and simply become passive bystanders as challenges are presented to us. When I met Cathy, not only did I met a capable and a talented nurse and medical worker, but I met someone who was a profoundly strong and clear voice on the most pressing issue which continues to challenge the city, which is the issue of housing. The issue of providing the most important social resource to people in the most vulnerable position you can imagine in a country not just as cold as Canada, but in a country anywhere in the world. Cathy had a way of describing the issue, of presenting the facts, and of humanizing the condition in a way that just compelled everyone who heard her voice to change their minds and to act responsibly and creatively to solve this problem. But Cathy also led by example. And I often refer to it as it's one thing to advocate for housing. It's another thing to care about the people who are homeless. It's another thing to push for social change or legislative change. It's another thing to tell a story using the voices of the homeless or using the voices of experts. But when push came to shove, and there were toenails that needed to be clipped, when there was frostbite that needed to be tended to, when there were social conditions that were imploding on people and in people that no one else seemed to have a healing hand to reach out with, Cathy would drop a microphone, walk away from an interview, surrender a conversation with someone that might actually make sort of institutional change, and she would tend to those who were in the most need, the folks on the sidewalks or in the shelters or in the tents or in poor housing, to make sure that their most basic fundamental humanity was not just tended to but recognized. It is an extraordinary honor to be a witness to the work that she did, to read the words that she has put to paper, to listen to the words that she has spoken, but it's even greater to find myself now in a position at City Council where we can start to listen to her and act, and we don't do it nearly enough. Even the most progressive councillors don't do it nearly enough. Bed bugs. Nobody was talking about bed bugs in this city before Cathy was, and we have still not followed through on her call for action. Social housing, in particular, social housing for the hardest people to house, those people with mental health and addiction issues, the people that no one wants to put under a roof. We still haven't delivered a zoning bylaw that puts rooming houses as of right across the city, supportive housing right across the city. And every time I see Cathy, now that I'm an elected official, I always feel like I've let her down. But I also know that we never let Cathy down. She just sits there and inspires us to do better. And tonight she has new words of inspiration, new words of kindness, new words of intelligence for us. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you one of the strongest, most vibrant, most wonderful, most friendly, kindest citizens this city has ever had the good graces to call a citizen of the city, Cathy Crowe.
I was going to say, I have tears in my eyes, it's allergies, but no, it's something else. Thank you, Adam. Thank you to the library for inviting me to be one of the speakers at this event. This is truly an honor. And to be introduced by Adam. I'm so glad you didn't think I was rude when I would walk away from you sometimes. And I'm looking forward to hearing Common Thread, the choir that's singing at the end of the evening, so don't leave. after I agreed to speak, I changed my title, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So my title now is "The Kitchen is the Heart of the Home." Now, June Callwood obviously has a legendary history and legacy of work on social justice, and I'm really honored to be giving the 5th June Callwood Lecture tonight. And I think June would want you to know how I first met her, and especially her daughter, I think, will appreciate this story. I was a fairly new community health nurse, and the health center I worked at was very progressive, and they allocated their staff to be volunteers on different organizations. So I was assigned to be a board member at Nellie's shelter. And one of the jobs we had to do as a board member was go in periodically on Sunday and cook Sunday dinner. And I was a single mom at the time, and I could cook for 2. And I remember being extremely intimidated at the thought of having to, cook for 40 people. But at the same time, June Callwood was in the kitchen. And so I arrived for my first shift, and you all know what June was like, and she was a real doer, so she immediately assigned me a role, and I kind of became her sous chef for the night. But I remember the day because I was nervous too and overwhelmed, because while you're there, you're thinking about why all these women and children had become homeless and ended up in a shelter. And it was the first time I'd been in a place like that and actually thought about it. So I felt like an intruder, and you're overwhelmed with the thoughts of why they're there. So I was very distracted. And I had, again, as I said, no experience cooking for 40 people. Unlike some people in the room that I know can do that. So cooking was really only one of June's many talents. But as I thought about it, I realized I've been in a lot of kitchens in my street nursing career, and I wanted to kind of tell you some stories through some of those kitchens, or in some cases, non-kitchens. And I think it'll help us kind of revigorate ourselves about why it's important to fight for our social programs. So the first one I want to tell you about is what I call Wilfred's Kitchen. And this is probably the roughest kitchen I ever saw on a home visit when I was a public health nurse. And I was visiting an old man who's, I'll call Wilfred for tonight, and he lived on a 3rd and possibly it was a 4th floor in a Cabbagetown rooming house. And he was a retired bartender from across the street. And he actually did not have a kitchen. He had a can opener, a fork, a knife, and a spoon. And his bedroom doubled as his bathroom. So he had a pail, which you can imagine what it was used for, right in the middle of his bedroom. And he made it really clear early on that he had a plan for me, his public health nurse. He was unable to get out anymore. And he directed me to shop for him once a week. And his shopping list was this: canned salmon and strawberries. And every week I would go back and say, "Are you sure you don't want something else?" And no, it was canned salmon and strawberries. And I tried to be more than just his grocery delivery nurse. I arranged for a doctor to make house calls. I got him on Ensure. I tried to have him relocated to a ground floor unit. I tried to convince him to accept Meals on Wheels. I was doing all of those extra things you would try to do, but he was really just happiest with me bringing him canned salmon and strawberries. But Toronto Public Health, who I worked for at the time, was not happy with his arrangement with me. And I actually was told by my supervisor to discharge him, i.e. fire him, because he was not meeting his goals. And if you know the bureaucracy of public health, places like that, that happens. So he was not meeting his goals. So I had to discharge him, but of course I did keep visiting him, every week or two when I could. And he eventually died. But that's what happens when programs get restructured, which, bringing it to today. When programs get restructured, who suffers the most? It's usually those who are most vulnerable. And today, as Adam kind of referred to, there are many Wilfreds, Winifreds in rooming houses across the city, way more than in those days. This was about 20 years ago. And their living conditions are worsened by what I call the twin plagues of extreme heat, which the city now faces in the summer during heat alerts, and, as Adam mentioned, bed bugs. So around that time, though, I did have the opportunity to spend some time in other types of boarding homes, rooming houses. And I put together a cookbook with another street nurse because this one collection of rooming houses we were visiting had amazing cooks in it, mostly older guys, and they shared a communal kitchen. And in the cookbook, the recipe titles actually say a lot. They say more than what the ingredients are that you're throwing in the pot. So, for example, one of the recipes was Ted's Poor Man's Potato Soup, and another was Art's Northern Bushwhacker Tea, telling you a little bit about where he came from. And here's the recipe for John and Buford's boarding house stew. Can of chicken soup, potatoes, rice, barley, egg noodles. And the directions then are you start with the chicken soup. I hope some of you have eaten because, you know, you might get hungry before I'm done. And you simmer for a few hours. And when you have leftover, you can add tomato soup the next day or carrots and peas. And then you put it on a cool spot on the window ledge. Don't leave on the stove. Now, I want you to note there's no actual chicken in this recipe, really. But it shows a lot of creativity, right? One meal morphs into another on day 2 or 3 or 4 when you add another can of soup or something. And there's also the creative use of the window ledge. And that's, of course, because there was no refrigerator, right, in the person's room. Now, I want to mention, though, that this cookbook was put together before the Mike Harris cuts of 21.6% for people's welfare social assistance budget. So, like, it's why I'm raising this recipe to kind of think what is happening today. And one of the things that's happening today is that we now have what I call kitchens for thousands. And if I thought cooking for 35 people at Nellie's was a gigantic effort, nothing prepared me for what I saw over the years in what we call the drop-in centers or the day shelters, where volunteers and staff routinely prepare meals for hundreds of people each day. One of them is Sistering, a very well-known drop-in center and program for women who are homeless and underhoused in Toronto. And they served 131,000 meals last year. On Christmas Day 2009, they served 100 women dinner. The very next year, 2010, that number was 300. So that tells you something about what's going on in these places of refuge where people go for food. Most of the drop-ins, you know, make the best of their donations. They get supplies from food banks, from Food Share, and they've got it down to a science, how to create a nutritious meal, stretching ingredients. They apply for grants for necessities like freezers for their food. Some, like the Meeting Place, Sistering, and others, develop catering capabilities so that they can create community economic development programs for the people that use their services. And organizations like ours over the years have really benefited. Often when we put on a rally or a demonstration or a public event, the #1 rule is you have to feed people. So we would often have one of these agencies put on the meal for us for 500 people at a price we could afford. And, you know, we used to say, and that's, maybe we should do this soon, at City Hall, Adam. Invite the mayor out for a meal with some poor people. So we used to say, though, that there was enough food in the city if people went to drop-ins in places like Scott Mission and if they were in shelters, and that people did not have to go hungry. And that is no longer the case. And to make matters worse, more people with medical conditions or with cultural food needs have a really difficult time meeting their food needs. So I want to now talk about what I call, well, the out of the cold kitchens. So the natural outcome of the cancellation of the federal and provincial housing programs was first most profoundly seen in Ontario and Alberta. And what it meant then was that the charitable sector, often the faith sector, had to pick up the slack. In 1998, Toronto Disaster Relief Committee declared homelessness a national disaster, and we called for emergency relief. But when that didn't really come, it meant that we had to go to these charitable solutions. And the very first Out of the Cold program, a church opening up its basement to feed and sleep people, was opened 25 years ago by Sister Susan. And they're now all across the country. Every city, every large town relies on synagogues and churches to open their basement to sleep hundreds of people. And, you know, church kitchens are famous for their food, their home cooking. Faith groups across the country have come together and they put on always a hot meal. They open their doors for one night. I call it a forced migration because each church opens for one night, so people have to move night by night. But the food is good. Turkey with all the trimmings, chicken curry with rice, shepherd's pie, nearly always a side of soup or salad, a dessert fitting a home-cooked Sunday dinner. And in most cases, folks that leave in the morning who may have to travel all across the city to get back to their hood, are often given a breakfast or a bag lunch to take with them. And we have one of the primary chefs from Blythewood Road Baptist here sitting in the front row, and he shared his recipe for shepherd's pie for 160 people with me. I won't read all the ingredients, but for one night, you know, close to 200 people come together. And so does 55 pounds of ground beef, 44 pounds of onions, 3 liters of vegetable oil, 110 pounds of potatoes. And Leonard, actually, my friend Leonard, was seen mashing them all. 33 pounds of frozen corn and peas, 22 pounds of salad. You know, I could go on and on. You get the idea. My speech will be up on my website if you want to get all the recipe. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is this is a Herculean effort. But it's for one night. And then come spring, these programs close. And I have to say that the folks that no longer have access to it also are more hungry as a result. So 24 years later, our city, and let's keep remembering it's our city, continues to rely on faith-based volunteer services to provide emergency shelter, crisis counseling, safety, and that does not seem right. And it happens across the country. I'm glad this one example is not happening in Toronto. I don't think we would let it happen here. In Calgary, families with children were forced to sleep in this Out of the Cold program. Children as young as 5 years old, being taken there on a school bus at night with their mums and dads, waking up at 5 in the morning to get on this, you know, the lights come on, breakfast, and to get them downtown to school. And then the next night, another church for those families and children. And we've documented that in the film series I did with Laura Skye called Home Safe. And then we have, believe it or not, curbside kitchen.